On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to talk about how to make a truly great traditional mead.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
Those of you who've been following the channel for a while probably know that we have never posted a just straight up traditional mead recipe. The closest we've gotten is our zesty traditional mead, and I'll put a card right up there. The reason we've never posted a traditional mead recipe is fairly simple. It's really difficult to make a traditional mead that appeals to every palate. I know this may come as a shock, but different people like different things. And at least in my decade of brewing experience, I have come to learn that traditional mead is one of those things that people either love, or they hate, or they tolerate. And for me, when I made my first mead many years ago, a traditional mead, I followed all the best practices, did it just like I would do my country fruit wines. And no matter what, every time I opened a bottle over the course of, it was like a year and a half, I hated it every time. And at that point, commercial mead was kind of hard to find. And I'd only had the popular brand mead that you can find at a lot of wine shops. And I didn't like that either. I didn't like it straight, I didn't like it hot, and I didn't like it mulled. So I just felt like maybe I didn't like mead. Flash forward a few years, and I felt like I had conquered country fruit winemaking. I had followed the advice of Jack Keller, I'd read a ton of books, and I felt like I was making truly great stuff. So I wanted a new challenge, and the new challenge ended up being mead. I wanted to revisit my mead making failures and figure out how to do this well and do it right. And that's when I came to learn that some of the tools in a winemaker's kit are almost more important in making mead at home than they are in making wines, particularly balancing acids and tannin. I feel like in a lot of country fruit wine recipes, you can get away without adding this stuff to it. And you can kind of rely on the acids inherent to the fruit, the skins for tannins, the stems, and mostly come away with a pretty good brew. But in making a traditional mead, where you're just talking about honey, water, and yeast, it can be really difficult to find your area of balance in the flavor profile, and specifically the flavor profile that suits your individual palate. You may prefer something more astringent. You may prefer something more sweet or more dry, maybe a round acid or a sharp, fresh pop of acid. And that's where we get into the elements of balancing a traditional mead. Because honey, water, and yeast are great on their own, but they can be exceptional with just some minor tweaks of the balance dial. And since we're talking about three things, sweetness, acid, and tannin, Anna suggested that we call this video the Triforce of Balance.
Well, excuse me, princess.
She's a big Zelda fan. And so, while we're not going to title the video that, we are going to use the Triforce as a visual representation of some of the things that we're talking about today. And while I'm going to present you my recipe for what I feel is the best traditional mead, don't take this as your truth. This is my truth. Your palate may differ from mine, and that is okay. I like my traditional mead a little bit on the lighter side. As you've probably seen here on the channel, we do a lot of hydromels, session meads, things like that, and I typically like to keep the alcohol content a little bit lower. For my traditional meads, that means they tend to fall in the 11 to 13% range. Now, this is a little bit higher alcohol than most of my brews, and what I find that turns into is a requirement for more tannin. Because there's more alcohol in suspension in the brew, I need more tannin to kind of round out the flavor profile of that on the palate. The easiest and simplest way of doing that is using powdered wine tannin that goes right into primary. You could also use tea leaves or even oak in secondary. Honey choice is also really crucial for a traditional mead because some honeys have a really robust character. As you've probably seen here on the channel, I like to play with buckwheat honey because it's a really rich and malty and complex and interesting honey. But for a traditional mead, I prefer something a little bit more fruity. And so for the pocketbook and ease of accessibility, orange blossom honey tends to be the honey of choice. Just a few months ago, I made a really lovely traditional mead with a big fruity blueberry blossom honey. But as I was balancing that one out, I felt like it needed more acid than what I might adjust an orange blossom traditional with. Fine-tuning the acid profile of a traditional mead is something that definitely takes palate practice. Sort of old school, Acid blend is one way that home winemakers will often balance the acid profile on their wines. This is sort of set up to mimic the acid profile of grapes. It's got citric acid, malic acid, and tartaric acid. Tartaric acid is a thing that I do keep on hand here with the gear, but I rarely, if ever, find myself using it. I prefer citric and malic acid. Malic acid is a dominant acid in grapes, but also in apples. It's that round, rich acid that you taste in there. Citric acid, as you probably know, is very common in citrus fruits, and it's got a bright pop of freshness to its acidity profile. For my traditional meads, and for my session meads, I like to balance with both citric and malic acid. Now, here's a caveat. Citric acid is used by bacteria for their metabolism, so you want to make sure that all of your equipment is sanitized with a no-rinse sanitizer like Starsan. Because if you're adding citric acid in primary, there's a chance that you're feeding a bacterial culture. So just make sure everything is sanitized and you should be good to go. Like I said, a lot of fruits have citric acid in them. One thing to note about malic acid is it can also be metabolized. Yeasts like 71B can use the maloethanolic pathway to convert some of the malic acid in your brew into ethanol. And malolactic fermentation cultures can actually convert all of your malic acid into lactic acid, which will really smooth out your brew. So you want to be aware of the yeast and microbes that are in your brew and how they're going to interact with your acids if you're adding them in primary. Also, you typically only want to add your acids in primary if you trust your recipe, because acids are pretty difficult to get back out of there once you've added them. So if you're unsure about the acid profile you want in your traditional mead, it's always best to amend your acids in secondary. And largely the same goes for tannin. Now, tannin added in primary will help with clarity, and tannin takes about 2 to 3 weeks generally to extract from the powdered form. If you're using oak, it can sometimes take less or more time depending on what form of oak and what kind of oak you're using. But I know and trust this recipe, so I'm comfortable adding my 8 grams of tannin right up front in primary. And then getting a good flavor and healthy yeast colony is really dependent on what kind of nutrition you have in your mead. It seems like most folks are now in agreement that raisins are not a good nutrient for mead.
So call me a cab.
Hey man, you're a cab.
And there are alternatives to store-bought nutrients, like boiling bread yeast and adding that into your must. There's also a form of nutrient called diammonium phosphate. It's an inorganically derived nitrogen, and it's good for some applications in mead making, up to a certain percent alcohol. For those of you who regularly tune into our content, you know that I prefer Ferment-O. It's an extract made from autolyzing yeast cells, and it's a good source of nitrogen, amino acids, vitamins, including B complex vitamins, which are water soluble, and it's not super expensive. The amount that we're gonna add over the course of the fermentation for this mead costs less than $2 for the whole 5-gallon batch. And we add that in a schedule of nutrients. I prefer the Tosna 2.0 nutrient schedule because mostly it's easy. And while I love to do the most, I'm also a little bit of a lazy brewer. So using just Ferment-O and calculating those 4 nutrient additions makes it super simple for me. And then lastly in our components, there's your yeast choice. And yeast choices are very personal, and also a lot of times really controversial. I don't know how many times on social media and on Discord channels I've seen people debate the merits of various yeasts, which I think is both appreciably super nerdy and also pretty cool that the community has gone all in on the minutia of mead making. I'm gonna go on the record here and say that my favorite yeast for a traditional mead is Lutra Kveik. Now, Lutra does have a listed alcohol tolerance of 11% ABV, and you can get it a little higher than that with proper nutrition. However, like I said, I like a more medium-bodied traditional mead, so 11% is right within that perfect realm for me. The other thing I love about Lutra is it tends to leave a residual sensation of sweetness in your brews. Even if your hydrometer reaches 1.000 or lower, I have found this yeast to leave a perceptible sweetness on the back end. I've tested and tasted this in several meads over the last few months, and it is predictably and pleasantly sweet when it's done. Another great thing about Kveik yeasts, you can wash them and dry them. And so basically 1 pack can be unlimited yeast. A caveat to using Kveik in mead is that it is a higher nitrogen requirement yeast, so you will need more nutrient than you typically might add with some other wine yeasts. I'll throw up our recipe card right here. With all these components and ingredients, we're looking at around $70 for a 5-gallon batch, which puts us under $3 per bottle. Not bad. The last thing I'll mention when we're constructing our recipe is use good water. I like to use spring water because I feel like the mineral balance on the palate is very pleasing and easy to drink. Just like you want to cook with wine you would drink, you want to make mead with water you would drink. And when it comes to yeast health, you also want to make sure you don't have chlorine content in your water. We have 4 gallons of water in here, and this mead is started with 11.5 pounds of orange blossom honey. This orange blossom honey, while it came wholesale, is really good, slightly zesty, and it makes a decent traditional mead. However, if you want to make a really excellent orange blossom traditional, you might want to taste test around and find a really nice orange blossom honey for your first go. The next thing we'll add is our tannin. This is 8 grams of red wine tannin. 4 grams of malic acid, 2 grams of citric acid. And then you're going to want to stir all that with a sanitized spoon to combine. And pitch our yeast. It's also a good best practice to whip a bunch of oxygen in there so your yeast have plenty of oxygen to work with as they begin their synthesis. And our nutrients will be added in a schedule, usually the first 24, 48, and 72 hours, and then again as you get 1/3 the way through the fermentable sugars in your mead. So we'll save those for later. You'll also want to use some sort of airlock to let gases escape, but also keep the bad buggies out. I like to recommend these breathable silicone airlocks because they don't require topping up with any liquid like Starzan or vodka like you would typically have in a bubbler airlock. So they're basically like no muss, no fuss, set it and forget it. They're also super low profile, so you buy yourself a few extra inches of clearance. And with a proper nutrient schedule, this will ferment for probably 2 to 3 weeks in primary. So let's take a deeper look at our Triforce of Balance. First off, tannin. I feel like tannin is often the most difficult thing, specifically for beginner brewers, to really build a palate for it. It's tough to describe, sometimes it's tough to sense unless it's overpowering. Often just enough tannin provides a nice round mouthfeel with a base of support for your other flavors, and often too much tannin brings on a mouth-sucking astringency that can be really offensive. Tannin comes in the form of polyphenols, a thing that is inherent to plants. It's in fruit skins, stems, leaves, wood. It's a naturally occurring thing. It builds body, it adds astringency, and it can also help with a sensation of dryness on the palate. However, you can overdo tannin, and if you do, it can be often hard, if not impossible, to remove it. Also, it may be difficult to choose the right source of tannin for your brew. Like I said, for a traditional mead, I like powdered tannin because it's super chill, it's easy to add, and it brings a consistent tannin element to my brew. But for certain honeys, certain acid profiles, you might prefer oak or tea. And like previously mentioned, it can be difficult to interpret on the palate. And so I recommend practicing to identify tannin, and mostly because it's fun, but also because it's a useful exercise. Our second element, acid, is also naturally occurring. It's very obviously present in fruits. It typically comes in the forms of citric, tartaric, or malic acid. You can introduce that through fruit. In one of our recent videos, we balanced a session mead by using lemon juice and apple juice to give it citric and malic acid. However, like I said, for fine tuning, powdered acids are a much simpler choice. Acid is the element of balance that can transform a brew relatively simply and relatively inexpensively. And also, there's a lot of room to play within the different acid profiles. Just like with tannin, you can overdo it. And also, like we previously discussed, some yeasts and bacteria can metabolize certain acids, so be careful about what active microbes are in your brew when you're making acid adjustments. And the final element of balance that completes our Triforce is sweetness. This can be fermentable sugars, non-fermentable sweeteners, non-fermentable sugars, it can be perceived sweetness, it can be artificial sweeteners. There are a lot of different ways to add sweetness to a brew. One of the things that I like about using Lutra Kveik in this brew is that it doesn't really need to be back sweetened. Lutra leaves just enough perceptible sweetness that it's plenty for my palate. That means you don't have to stabilize or pasteurize or brew up to a high alcohol like 17-18% until your yeast gives up, which means you can have a lighter, medium-bodied traditional mead that still tastes sweet with no added processes piled on top of what you're already doing. In a traditional mead, sweetness can be really clutch. It is a major balancing element. It can balance too much acidity. It really builds on top of tannin in a good way. It adds mouthfeel and heft and richness to a traditional mead. And in other mead styles, it can enhance a lot of flavors that are in there, like the flavors from caramelized sugars or fruits or other adjuncts. Making sure that you have your tannin, acid, and sweetness all in balance is what's gonna make the best brew for your palate. The perfect traditional mead is the mead that is perfect for you. Understanding balance does take a lot of practice. It's really simple for anyone to make a homebrew. Anyone can make a drinkable homebrew. But I really believe that learning how to tweak those dials to balance in your acid, your sweetness, your tannin is what can take a good traditional mead and make it into a great traditional mead. I spent a lot of time learning how to make mead. I've made a lot of good mead, I've made a lot of terrible mead, I've made some mead that's ended up in the compost bin. But my greatest meads, my greatest traditional meads are the ones where all those three elements just lock in perfectly. Is your acid out of whack? Try adding a little bit of back sweetening. Is your brew a little bit watery? All you're tasting is the acid and sweetness? Try adding some tannin. Just a few minor modifications might bring the whole thing into balance. So again, here's the recipe for what we brewed today, and here's the recipe for what we're tasting today, because no how to brew mead video would be complete without a tasting. This mead was also brewed with Lutra Kveik. This was brewed with blueberry blossom honey, and it needed a little bit more acid, at least for my palate, than what I'm comfortable adding in an orange blossom traditional mead. Just because that blueberry flavor that's inherent to the blossoms, to that nectar, needs a little bit more of an acid profile support to heft it up. This also had a little bit more tannin than this one because again, that honey needed it to create that fullness of the fruity flavor that you get in this honey. This one had a little sparkleoid added, but it mostly cleared with time because I got busy. You pick up the blueberries and honey on the nose, and even though the acid is enhanced to a level that I wouldn't with something like this, you don't pick up any of that acid on the nose. It just smells like fruit. Now, as far as a traditional goes, this is on the drier side, but because of that Lutra Kveik, you do have just that little bit residual sensation of sweetness that fills in the gaps there. The tannin is nice, it hits you right in the sides of the tongue, and then the acid kind of carries that fruity flavor around, so you can really sense it. It almost drinks like a table wine, like a white wine, but right in the middle of your tongue, you pick up that honey flavor. A lot of folks who like traditional mead might still want this a little bit back sweetened. But for me, for somebody who likes a drier end product, this is actually quite lovely. It's balanced, and that makes it really nice. It's only about 3 to 4 months old right now, so by mid to late summer, it should be hitting its peak, but currently, perfectly drinkable. If you found anything or everything valuable about this video today, please hit that like button and maybe subscribe and hit that bell icon for notifications. We put out a lot of homebrewing content, including a lot of mead content, so join along with us. You can find us on Instagram and Pinterest at doingthemostok. We have a website, doingthemost.org. We're on Twitch at doingthemostok. And we've got a Discord server at discord.doingthemost.org. Big shout out to our YouTube members and patrons for supporting the channel. So I've presented you what I believe is the best traditional mead. Let me know what you believe is the best traditional mead down in the comments. Until next time, happy brewing, stay safe.